Some of the older amongst you, and indeed maybe some of the younger, might recognize that scene from many a supermarket where you're standing in the queue about to purchase something and you look around and you see the magazines and what have you, and in particular, you see several, if not rows, of these books that can often be described as cheesy female romance fantasy. They usually have some Fabio-like figure on the cover, some woman being embraced, some guy that looks like a Chad, as we would call them in 2020. And for a very long time, these types of books were silent bestsellers, which is to say, there was not a lot of public knowledge about the fact that these were probably some of the best-selling books out there, especially to women, considering that these books were written by women most of the time for women, really for decades throughout the 20th century. But it was really kept on the DL. It wasn't necessarily a dirty little secret, but it was pretty obvious that it wasn't a common topic of conversation at the dinner table or in the mainstream or in the news. It was just something women did. They voraciously consumed these romance novels, which often depicted very lurid sexual scenes and almost always had some untouchable, unreachable Chad who fell for plain Jane, because it's always plain Jane, who is pretty unremarkable, but because she is who she is quote-unquote special. This was the consistent routine recipe of success at the time for these types of books. But today I want to go well beyond that and describe what I would call the rise of the feminine fantasy insertion. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean all the things I've talked about with regards to these cheesy romance novels, but the fact that gynocentric tendencies, that is, things that placate and favor women's preferences, have grown enormously since the days of some book row in a supermarket or a bookstore in 1985. Now, specifically, what kickstarts this is Twilight. Now, why do I mention Twilight? That is the cheesy romantic vampire series written by Stephenie Meyer for a female audience. And the reason I mention Twilight is because Twilight taps into most of the aspects of this female insertion fantasy that had previously mostly been not talked about on the DL in these romance novels, and goes well beyond that. So you have this character Bella, who's completely plain Jane, average, unremarkable, and long story short, she has two supernatural men, or males, who are both versions of some Chad vying for her attention. You have Edward Cullen, the pale, mysterious, vampiric guy, and you have Jacob, the athletic, Native American, wolf spirit, Indian, shapeshifter, whatever you want to call him. And they're both obsessed with this character, Bella, who herself is just nobody special at all. And of course, eventually she goes for the mysterious vampire guy because, let's be honest, he's higher in prestige. But somehow, and I never read the books, but I did see the films because I was dragged into it back in the day, she still maintains some kind of relationship with Jacob, the wolf spirit shifter, because Jacob imprints on her daughter and they create some weird relationship, and it's somehow one big family where everyone gets along and blah, 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 blah. And here's the consistent pattern. Plain Jane, unremarkable, really amazing guys who, for no other reason than her being herself, which is totally unremarkable and average, are fascinated by her. That is the epitome of the female fantasy. And as we all know, Twilight did really, really, really well at the box office. But Twilight was missing certain elements, specifically the raunchier, more lurid elements that I alluded to in some of these romance novels that, if you were to pick them up, you would see on display on a near constant basis. The darker fantasies women have, basically. And along came 50 Shades of Grey, which arose as fan fiction of Twilight, and captured other elements of the female self-insertion fantasy, namely an extreme bad boy who engages in extremely odd behavior in the bedroom, specifically behavior that's appealing to women. It's all consensual, of course. There's certain unsavory elements there. And of course, this guy, Christian Grey, he's untamable. And of course, again, the protagonist is plain Jane, unremarkable, and for whatever reason, this CEO, this bad boy, takes note of her just because she's there and she is what she is. The difference, however, and one element that is missing in Twilight, is the fact that in this specific case, she's trying to tame this unconquerable, untamable guy. This super Chad who takes an interest in her for no other reason other than she being herself. And here's the thing about 50 Shades of Grey. Based on the things you can look into, it appears to have been the biggest, best-selling piece of fiction in the history of humanity, certainly in recent times. And if you want to compare the two on a point-by-point basis, just in terms of raw numbers and sales, it seems to me that the aspects of female insertion fantasy that I've discussed resonate even more when it comes to the stuff in 50 Shades of Grey, the more lurid stuff, the more dangerous stuff, rather than the safer stuff presented in Twilight, of course. Of course, Twilight is more a princess finds the prince happily ever after scenario, where the princess is not really a princess, but plain Jane. But it's obvious based on the sales and the numbers that 50 Shades of Grey taps into the female psyche much more than Twilight ever could. Of course, Twilight was also PG-13, effectively written by a religious woman, etc., etc. But these two films, in many ways, kickstarted something that used to not be privy to the public, because, of course, women would read these types of novels voraciously and constantly, and they were huge bestsellers in their own right, but men were not aware of these things. So this kickstarted all of it. But in the current year, or the current era, we have interesting attempts at female self-insertion that don't really jive with the public in the same way that these very direct attempts, embodied by Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, do. Namely, very woke takes on superheroes, specifically female superheroes. Now, the one consistent characteristic that you can see across all of this fiction, as written by women, as conceived of by women, in some cases written by men, but for women, is that there's something innate yet unremarkable about the person, even when they're superheroes. So, for example, this character Rey from Star Wars, and by the way, I stopped paying attention to Star Wars after the 80s, but I know a little bit about what's going on. She just has this innate ability to tap into the Force. No struggle, whatever. And if you were to ask me, if you look at DC or Marvel comic book characters, many of the female characters and heroes are not incredibly well fleshed out, with the possible exception of Wonder Woman. But Wonder Woman herself, her entire story is a feminine fantasy, right? The Amazons removed from the evil world of men, etc., etc. Now, what is the primary difference, the consistent difference between every male hero, every male fantasy figure of any importance, in contrast to the female ones? And I would argue it is the process of self-forging, the tribulations, the trials, the difficulties, and the internal struggles they have, even in cases when the hero is incredibly powerful. And depending on the version of Superman you're looking at, Superman is possibly the most powerful hero out there, or one of the most powerful heroes, and yet he has many internal struggles about ethics, about principles. How does he use his power? Holding back, not abusing it. What does Uncle Ben tell Peter Parker and Spider-Man? He says, with great power comes great responsibility. It's not enough that Spider-Man is super agile and super strong and fast and all these things. He needs to make use of it for the greater good. Superman needs to think about the consequences of his actions. He needs to think about whether or not he's doing the right thing. And even somebody like Bruce Wayne, Batman, who has no superpowers, who is born into vast wealth, he forges himself anew. Batman is a product of all the work and effort that Bruce Wayne puts into himself, trying to achieve the peak of what it means to be a non-meta-human in terms of gadgets, in terms of intelligence, in terms of dedication to principles, which is why he doesn't kill people like the Joker, even though it's his instinct to do so, because he knows if he were to do that, he would fall into a pit of darkness from which he possibly would never come back. All of these heroes and characters go through some struggle. It doesn't matter if they're rich. It doesn't matter if they can smash planets to bits and pieces. They have to struggle with themselves and with the world. In some cases, like with Superman, he needs to come to terms with his power and hold back. He needs to not be abusive towards people who are not as strong or as powerful as he is. In some cases, it's becoming aware of knowing that when you have these superhuman abilities, you need to make use of them for the greater good. In some cases, like the Silver Surfer, Norrin Radd, who's empowered by Galactus to help him devour his planets, he has to take a principled stand too. All of these male heroes and characters have to go through some transformative process that is severely lacking in the female characters. Whether it's Rey, whether it's the characters I mentioned earlier, whether it's a woman in something like Hunger Games, this transformative, constant struggle of working through yourself, of struggling against yourself, even when you're the most powerful person out there, is a consistent theme. Even Thor in the comics, who is technically a god, he's on Midgard or planet Earth for a long period of time because his father Odin wants to impart wisdom and humility into him. And so when you see the larger-than-life female characters writ large onto a screen or made for public consumption, they rarely go through this stuff. And you can also notice that most of these films are not very successful at the box office, which is to say, they do not have the same cachet of a Twilight or a 50 Shades of Grey. Women, as a rule, don't spend their time fantasizing about being superheroes. And to the extent that men do, it's not just about being a superhero. It's about having responsibility with that power and wielding it, typically for the greater good, but sometimes in more internal conflicts and struggles. And what we've seen in recent years is a departure from the stuff we saw in the earlier 21st century with 50 Shades of Grey or Twilight, and an attempt to put the female fantasy into Marvel and DC heroes where it just doesn't really fit because they're not really struggling internally with things in the same sense that the male characters do. And by and large, it's been a flop. Rey is a great example of this, of course. If you want to compare her struggle with Luke Skywalker, well, it's not even close. Luke Skywalker is obviously very talented in the Force, but talent doesn't mean anything. You could be the fastest sprinter in the world, but if you never get off your butt and sprint and do something and train, nothing's going to happen. The idea, and the consistent idea with the female insertion fantasy, is either that the woman in question is just a plain Jane, and for whatever reason, the object of romantic obsession fantasy by some Giga Chad, or in the case of female heroes, the way they're being written and designed, and I think it's intentional, they're simply made. They just exist, and as such are already perfected, and yet that formula fails to impress and does not achieve the same degree of resonance that all of us find in the struggles and difficulties of a male superhero, whether he is at the level of Superman or a mere human like Batman, or everything in between. For example, The Thing. The Thing is pretty strong, but he's outclassed by so many other guys out there in the Marvel Universe, and he still takes them on, and he tries to use tricks and intelligence to outwit them. And that's what we like about Ben Grimm, The Thing. It's not that he's the strongest guy out there. I think at his best he could press maybe 85, 90 tons compared to the potential unlimited strength of the Hulk, compared to the Juggernaut, compared to so many other characters that are stronger. It's just that he has that attitude. He doesn't give up. We admire that. None of these flavors that characterize our favorite male heroes are found in the female heroes. Why do we appreciate Luke Skywalker? Because he struggles, he suffers, he loses things in his effort to master the Force, become something greater. We don't see any of that in these modern female incarnations of Jedi Knights, at least as it's presented to us in terms of comic book heroes these days. Anyway, I wanted to address this issue because it's been bubbling up now for years. And in any event, as always, if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. And as always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.